Welcome back, and welcome to the last section for this particular series of videos. In this section, we're going to cover the area of Azure that is going to finally start to provide some business value and functionality subscription into your Azure deployment, and that specifically is Azure Compute. Now, within Azure Compute, Microsoft includes a number of both infrastructure as a service as well as platform as a service items. And we will talk about those in this first video where we will go through what all of the different pieces are that make up Azure Compute. But as you can see, the primary item that we're going to be talking about is going to be virtual machines and how you can start and stop them, how you can create them, how you can actually create repeatable ones via VM images and snapshots, or whether you might want to leverage images that have been provided by a third party, such as the ones that can be found within the Azure Marketplace. Then we'll move into availability sets, which can provide some scaling and fault tolerance for your virtual machines. And then lastly, we'll talk about the scripting and how you can create and deploy your virtual machines into those availability sets and tie that all back into the scripting that we did for the Azure networking in the previous section. But in this particular video, we're going to focus on the compute overview. And as I mentioned, that will cover both infrastructure as well as platform as a service items. But we'll first start to look at the virtual machines and all of the related services that make up that virtual machine. We'll then dive into VM images, availability sets, and then lastly, we'll talk about all of the platform as a service items, but we'll not go into any depth about them, where we'll be talking about batch, service fabric, and containers. So let's head back on over to the portal and we'll get started. Okay, so we're back in the portal, and what I'm going to do is just like I've done with all of the other sections, is open up the navigation and go up to the Azure Compute section, and let's talk about each of the individual items here within Azure Compute. And then we'll dive into some of these in more detail in the upcoming videos. Now, obviously, compute to start with, and this is what every customer pretty much uses, especially if they're going to be doing any kind of infrastructure as a service deployment, is virtual machines. And these are the same kinds of virtualized machines that you would get if you were using VMware, Azure Stack, or one of OpenStack, things like that on-prem. They give you compute, they give you memory, they give you disk, all of the things that you need in order to be able to deploy your applications inside of the Azure cloud environment. As I've mentioned with other previous types, there are classic versions for the old type of Azure framework, but we're not going to be talking about those. The next item is virtual machine scale sets, and this also ties into availability sets down here. Availability sets gives you fault tolerance within a given Azure region, making sure that if you happen to be putting multiple VMs together that have the same software, that are providing the same functionality behind a load balancer, that you make sure that not all of them are affected at the same time if there is a minor outage in Azure or if there is maintenance going on in Azure. And we'll obviously talk about this in more detail later. Virtual machine scale sets provide that same level of capability, but remove the customer from being able to control that and let the algorithms of the Azure framework do it for you, thereby guaranteeing that your VMs are in the most fault tolerant state possible. But in addition to that, virtual machine scale sets also provide you with auto-scaling capabilities for virtual machines. And before virtual machine scale sets came around, the only item that had auto-scaling capabilities was your platform as a service app services, which that we'll be talking about in a future video series. The next item, which we will not be talking about in this video section, is container services. And this is a fairly new feature where Microsoft is actually providing 3 different flavors of container orchestration engines, specifically Kubernetes, DCOS, and Docker Swarm. And then you can actually provide clusters of VMs with your applications or microservices deployed within a Microsoft managed set of container services. Batch accounts allows you to run batch processes using Azure Virtual Machines as the back end for those batch processes. Once again, this is more of a platform as a service type item, so we will not be talking about them in any depth in this particular video series. The next is Service Fabric clusters. This is a Microsoft developed set of microservices and container orchestration capabilities that we will talk about in a future video series, but it provides a lot of great capabilities that compete with the Kubernetes and Docker swarms of the world, while also providing a pure microservices-based orchestration capability that the container services do not provide. So that is something, and the Service Fabric clusters actually are built on top of virtual machine scale sets, which is why it falls under the compute area. And the same thing is true for container services, but of course in container services, you're really only interacting with the containers, whereas in Service Fabric clusters, you actually do have the ability to manipulate the VM sizes and things of that nature. Cloud services is a classic platform as a service model. It is what was available before app services became available. We will not be talking about this at all because Microsoft does want customers to use app services over cloud services, but it is there for those customers who are still on it today. And it is backed by virtual machine instances as well, hence why it is still under the compute area. Remote app collections is something that is actually going to be going away, so we will not be talking about that at all, but that would provide remote desktop or remote desktop type capabilities. Container registries are tied very closely to container services, and when we do talk about containers in more detail, we'll cover this. But you can think of container registries much like you think of the Azure Marketplace, where you're defining or providing a set of images, in this particular case containers, that have software installed on them, are already pre-configured for a specific type of application that you're going to be deploying over and over again. And it provides you to build your own registry rather than using a public registry like Docker Hub, for example. Availability sets we already talked about. The next two items, or next three items, are very specific to virtual machines. As if you'll remember, when we covered storage a couple of sections ago, I mentioned that there are two different kinds of disks available to you when you deploy a virtual machine: managed disks and unmanaged disks. Unmanaged disks are actually deployed within the storage account. They do not come up as a separate resource item inside of Azure. Managed disks, on the other hand, do come up as separate items, which means you can actually create disks individually and independently of virtual machines and then connect them to a virtual machine later if you should so desire. The snapshots are where you're wanting to create replicas of virtual machines, and you want to do it in a very generic manner. So you've created a virtual machine, you've got everything installed on it the exact way that you want with all of the right disks. You then create what are called disk snapshots. These are just basically point-in-time images of each of the individual disks for that particular virtual machine. You can then, using those snapshots, create new virtual machines that will create their own disks based on the information stored within those snapshots. So it's a way for you to create multiple versions of the same virtual machine over and over again without having to have a full VM snapshot and only have just the disk snapshot. So that third then item is the image, and that is a full VM snapshot or a full VM image. And there are two different kinds of images. There are standard image and then there are sysprepped images. Standard images are you're taking a snapshot of the VM exactly as it sits today. That means when you go and create a new version of it, it's going to have the same name, the same IP address, all of the same configuration information. And of course, if you were to duplicate that within the same subnet in the same virtual network, you would run into many, many different kinds of conflicts, both networking and operating system conflicts. And of course, that's not something that you would potentially want. However, if you're just creating the image for disaster recovery purposes, or to deploy into another region, therefore in another virtual network, you might be able to get away with that kind of an image. On the other hand, if you're going to be creating duplicates of the same virtual machines over and over again, and you need them to have different names, different IP addresses, different configurations, then you're going to want to do what's called a sysprept image, which is basically creating a generic version of the virtual machine. It'll have the operating system installed, it'll have the applications installed, but it will not get a name, IP address, configuration information until you create it inside of Azure and actually bring it up to a started state. The next two items are both classic items, so we're not going to cover those. The next three are, one of them is preview and really doesn't tie too much into Azure Compute. Plus, it really is for third-party vendors who are going to be deploying applications to the Azure Marketplace. The next two are specific to Citrix, and they will be replacing the remote app collections that you saw up here, hence why I didn't want to talk about those. And Citrix are third-party, but Microsoft has a very tight partnership with Citrix to provide remote desktop type capabilities for customers who need to have that. So instead of customers having full-on desktops with all of their applications installed on them, they actually use virtual machines in the cloud with Citrix application deployments so that they can actually access those applications from the web rather than having to have them all installed locally. And then the last item is function apps. Function apps is not really compute, it's actually more app services, but it is fallen under the compute category here. So this is just a quick overview of everything with respect to virtual machines. Now the last thing I want to talk about is with respect to virtual machines, there are some things that have to come together in order for the virtual machine to actually be deployed successfully. I've already touched on one of them, and that's the disks. So if you're using managed disks, then more than likely when you create the VM, it's going to be creating the disks for you, at least the OS disk. You might have to go back and create the required data disks afterward. But if you are using unmanaged disks, then you will need to make sure that a storage account is created or that it will get created as part of the VM creation process so that the disks can be placed in there. The last thing is the network interface card. Now, we covered network interface cards in the last section of networking, but that is an absolute required component for every single virtual machine that gets deployed. And some virtual machines, especially some of the third-party virtual appliances from the marketplace, will actually require you to provide multiple virtual machines or multiple network interface cards because of the type of functionality that it is providing, especially if it's going to be handling a lot of user-defined routing type situations, packet sniffing, things along proxies, things along those lines. So those are going to be all required resources. Now, luckily, and you'll see this when we go through the wizard in the next video, the wizard will allow you to create those things on the fly. One of the optional resources, and I think I touched on this also in the last section of videos, is public IPs. You can actually apply a public IP directly to a VM and specifically to the network card of that particular VM. So there are upwards of 3 to 4 tied-in resources that are required or are optional for virtual machines to actually be up and running successfully. You cannot just deploy a virtual machine as is. And of course, this makes both the creation in the portal as well as the creation via scripting much more complicated than some of the other things that you've seen us do in the past. So with that, let's head back over to the deck and we'll talk about what's coming in the next video.